So thank you very much for coming. I think it's amazing to actually present to people who know something about the engineering and about a lot of stuff, because most of the presentations that I do are more businessy. And so this is a nice change of pace, I would say. So as it was pointed out, I'm Jiří. I am a CEO and founder of Supernova, but most importantly, I'm also a developer like you. I have been developing for almost 20 years, and I'm 29, so you can say that it was most of my life. I have started with websites, eventually moved to games, and when mobile applications came out, I wanted to be instantly rich. So, and I think a lot of people did that. So I started with mobile apps. Obviously, that didn't work out, right? So I was continuing doing the mobile apps. Overall, I did over 80 mobile projects for iOS, sometimes Android, but iOS was my primary platform for a long time. I think if you do something like that for such a long time, you will eventually get bored of it. So you really only have two choices. You can either change what you are doing, but that was not an option for me because I really like the development, or you will find ways how to make it interesting. And for me, it was always automation. I like automation. I was always lazy, so I was trying to cheat my way out of work. And really, the idea of Supernova is all about the automation. But before we get to that, I would like to talk about the state of the industry, about the state of designers and developers now. So I think that when you consider the industry as a whole, there are pretty interesting problems that a lot of people is trying to solve. Many of those is basically originating from the communication between designers and developers, right? They are very different worlds. Designers are more creative, while developers, and I'm not saying that they are not creative, but developers are more analytical people, right? And when those two worlds communicate with each other, they will clash quite a lot. You will also pretty much very well know that there is a lot of repetition in what you are doing. Just an example to throw out: if you are doing like asset extraction, if you are preparing your images, you have to export them in different resolutions. Of course, there are tools that do it for you, but there is still some work behind them, right? There are designers who have to prepare them. There are designers who have to mark assets as exportable, and so on. This all stems from the lack of automation, because it is extremely complicated to do automation in development toolchain in general. I'm not talking about that it's very hard to create libraries or something like that, but like a general automation that we could effectively hand off quite a lot of work from designers or developers altogether without just a human factor at all. And I think the last point is the most pressing one, especially like for me as a startup founder. Those are overloaded teams. It is said that for every developer, there is currently 5 projects that will never be born, right? It's just the state of the industry. There is not enough developers for how much work we have to do. So when we started to build Supernova, we really wanted to build on these building stones. First, we wanted to basically automate creation of the interfaces, because from my experience, building interfaces is always the same, right? You are always using the same components, you are always using the same widgets, you're just using them in different ways, and you are constructing them in different ways. There is also a lot of repetition, as we said, so we wanted to remove all the boring work, I would say, and also the stuff that repeats, like the asset extraction, like creating layouts, and so on. We also wanted to build a system that is generic enough, so when a platform like Flutter comes, because we have started development of Supernova much sooner than the Flutter was even a thing, right? So we wanted to make a generic system that allows us to adapt to the needs of the developers in certain time. So we started with iOS, added Android, then added React Native because it was cool, and then added Flutter because I think Flutter is the future of the multi-platform applications. Hopefully it will be. It's much better than the systems that are currently out there. For a startup like ours, it's also very important to integrate with workflows that are currently there, right? You will find the tools that do certain automation, but they usually require that you adjust your workflow in a very specific way. And that really doesn't work because, for example, convincing a designer to better structure their designs or name them properly, it just doesn't work. You cannot convince them. Maybe Google can, maybe Apple can. They can make the rules, but if you are starting from nothing, basically, then you can't. And ultimately, this all leads to increasing the quality of and also the quantity of created apps. If there is enough work for everyone, even if we automate like 80% of the tasks, there will be still enough work for everyone, right? So ultimately, you have more time, and the applications are usually also better because right now you are almost always constrained with your time, with your resources. If you could automate most of the stuff, you could actually focus on making the applications better, maybe add some micro animations, some things like that, but you can't. This is a great quote from some random internet user that I found when I was preparing this presentation. It says, if brute force doesn't solve your problem, then you aren't using it enough. Thank you, random internet user, because if I knew that, I wouldn't spend 4 years building Supernova and I would just brute force the solution. But it really doesn't work out, so we had to figure out something that is much smarter. So the biggest challenges that we encountered when building a system like this, and by the way, there will be a demo of Supernova and you will know what it does, but I really wanted to just discuss the state before we get to there, because then you will understand a lot of decisions that we made. So the biggest challenges that we did and that we encountered, I think the most basic one is just understanding the design, right? The basic idea of Supernova is that you take a design and you convert it to code. Many startups tried that. It's certainly not a new idea, but almost everyone failed, right? In fact, everyone failed. And it all stems from understanding the design. Because design doesn't mean code, or design layers doesn't mean code components. And I will give you a very easy example. Take just like a button that you are implementing, right? So button in Sketch is usually represented like 4 layers. It can be background and then something that groups it together. Maybe some text, maybe an icon. And you, as a human, really, you will just look at it and see, okay, this is a button, and I should use a button component to represent it, right? I will not create it as 4 layers, but instead I will pick something from the toolchain that makes it easy for me to represent something like this. Of course, I also want behaviors, so I want to make it clickable and such. But you don't really have that information on a sketch level, right? Or if you are using Figma or if you are using Adobe, it's just not there. That conceptuality comes from really you thinking about the application and how it should be implemented. About the second point, there are also no design standards. If you've done several projects, you know what I'm talking about. One designer will give you a perfectly structured design that is named and is amazing to work with. Another one can give you basically a flat list of layers, right? It will look the same, but the structure is very different. So if you would use some sort of brute force algorithm to figure out what it actually means, you would have to go through all the possible solutions, and we just don't have computing power to do that. So, as I was saying when I was talking with some of you, we've been creating Supernova for 4 years, and 3 years out of those were basically just the failures. We really tried to find a solution that could be generic enough to bring a code automation to design. So how does the Supernova work? It's really a very basic workflow cycle. At first, you import the design, and Supernova somehow understands the design. It doesn't import the design one-to-one, because if you worked with the design, with designs in general, you will know that there are usually like layers that are extraneous, and then maybe there are layers that don't really fit into a mobile development. Maybe there is a flat structure, so it needs to be structured properly, and so on. So there is a lot of optimizations that go into the design import, and it's not just like importing one-to-one that most tools do, and we will get to that. Then the second part is design enhancement, and that is what you as a user do. You can do animations, you can do navigation, you can do layouts, even though layout in Supernova is done for you. Supernova can create completely responsive apps just by importing the design. And on that layer, you are basically adding the functionality to the application, right? You still have a visual representation of the app, but you add the functionality. And then finally, you have a production export. As I was saying, we started to support iOS and Android because those were the platforms available when we started. Then added React Native, but lately we've switched to higher gears on Flutter. And Flutter is basically our youngest platform. It's also the most iterated one, I would say. And above all of that, you also have iterations, right? Because creating app is not a one-way process. You always do enhancements in the beginning, and then you basically start the cycle all over. So maybe your designer will create a new screen, so you import design again. Supernova can match your design changes that you did, then you enhance that part, then you export the code. So what are we currently automating? First of all, we can export the design one-to-one as it is in Sketch and XD. And we also optimize the designs based on our experience, really, how the mobile applications should work. There is also a lot of customizations that you can do on that stage. We convert the code components or layers to code components and widgets. So when I was talking about the button in Supernova, you can say, okay, this group of like visual representation should really be a button, and it will basically infer the information that it requires, let's say, to a button like a title color, title itself, and so on. We also fully automate the asset extraction and prepare them for production use. So, in fact, the extraction engine is so good that we are currently ignoring the information from the designers. Like if you've worked with Zeppelin, for example, you always have to set layers that are exportable, and then they will actually show up. But in Supernova, when you push the design, it will just run through all of that and give the assets to you. This has several advantages because we can do cool stuff like, for example, that we can remove the duplicates, right? So if you have like back buttons and you have 20 of them, in Zeppelin, you would really have 20 back buttons, but in Supernova, it will be just one. And if it's different size, then you will have two, and so on. And I think the most interesting part about Supernova is the last two things. First, we generate automatic flagbox. So when you import the design, and I will show that to you because I just love that part of the demo. The application is responsive automatically. You as a user, of course, have a control over that, but from our testing, it is like 98 to 99% perfect. And then we can do navigations, so like screen-to-screen or tab navigations, animations, basically a full offering what Flutter currently has, and some more because we have created animation toolkit for it. which Artem will talk about, and then we also do localizations using the Google Neural API. So you can just say, localize me the application to the languages, and it will do that. And finally, you can take all of that and export it to basically a configuration of your choosing. You can either export the project, so then you can immediately run it, or you can export just part of the project, like a screen. Let's say that your designer did a new screen. You don't really need the entire project. You can just export one screen. So I think I was talking for long enough. If you just let me sit, and I will show you the demo of the application. So we have like 10 minutes to do the entire app. So let's do that. This is a sketch file, and you can see that there is really nothing special about it, right? In fact, when you look at this button or this logo, it consists of a lot of parts, a lot of groups, all of that. So you can see that there is no magic. In fact, this is madness, right? So a lot of parts, and I can just import that to Supernova. I will say import from the sketch. You can see that the visual representation is still the same. I want all screens because I want to do the entire app. It runs the analysis, and now it actually shows the application in this sort of visual editor, which has two modes. The first one is the edit mode, and it is basically what you will find in Sketch or in Ruby XD. You can just move things around. But one thing you will find is that it didn't get imported one-to-one, right? You can see that from all those layers, like 200 layers, I think, it just got squished to the bare minimum that is needed to represent the application. As I was saying about the exported assets, here is the asset editor, and you can see that all the icons are properly extracted. The names are obviously used from the names of the layers, but you can also rename them. And then if you re-import it again, it will actually stay renamed. So you as a developer can do a lot of improvements on that. One thing you will also notice is that it is pretty well structured and pretty well optimized, but all of those layers are exported to atomic components. Atomic components are of three types. The first one is image container. The second one is container itself, like view. And then there are text, right? Text cannot be represented by any other way than just like text containers. And you, as a user, your work is basically to say, okay, those are like 4 layers, but I really want them to be a button, right? So what you can do is you can say convert it to component, and we basically provide you with a list of components from the native SDK. And I will say convert it to a button. And now you can see that instead of those 4 layers, it actually became one that it says button. And if you go to Property Inspector, you can see that this one has all the properties of a button, like image position and insets and icons. But it's no longer a structure that was there, right? It's not a group and inside another group, an icon and text. So this is basically the only thing you have to do for this screen. You can argue that the second one should probably also be a button, so I will just do that using shortcuts. I've also converted that to a button. And now, as I was saying, we have the edit mode, but we also have a preview mode. And preview mode is basically a simulation of a real mobile app. So when I switch to preview mode and I click on this button, you can actually see that it behaves like a button. And that's because it actually is a button, right? What I also want to show you is that, as I was saying, that the application is automatically responsive. You can see that it somehow guessed that this should be the responsivity, right? Maybe you want to choose something different. You, of course, can. There are settings for all of that. So you have different behaviors, but we don't really have to go into details of that. The important thing is that at the beginning, it just imports the design, and then it infers the rules based on the structure, based on the information it has, based on the content. There is actually quite a lot going under the hood. In fact, I think at this point, I think it's even too complicated for me to explain it, because we have been developing it for such a long time. But anyway, this is like the first screen, and now all the components are probably done, right? So let's move to another one. This is a bit more complicated. You can see that there are still some buttons. They are actually using the Google Material icon font. And so I can just take this, convert it to buttons, and I will also convert this to a button. You can see that I click on it, it just selects the proper group. I probably also, no, I don't want this, but I certainly want to forget password. And now there are just text fields to be done, right? Text fields are, or text inputs are available to you as well. Again, it supports most of the native library, so you can just convert it to text field, maybe make it longer, and do the same thing with the first one, which also snaps to the second one. And now when I switch to preview, you can see that the application rescaled to my last one. But all of those components are again something that behaves like a real component. So when I click on those buttons, it does work. When I type here, it actually behaves as an input. If I type to a password, it even knows that it should be a secure password on its own, because there is a rule that says if it's a password, make it secure. On this screen, I think we also want to improve the layout a bit, because you really want to probably scale it to the edges. So in this case, I will just say, okay, this container shouldn't be centered, but it should snap to left and right. And now when I switch to preview, this container actually resizes properly. I can also do the same with the button. So I will do that. And you probably have this screen done. One thing that I want to point out is that you also can do navigation bars, but I want to show you the most complicated one on the last screen. Before we get to the last screen, of course, as developers, you are probably wondering, hey, this is like pretty cool and nice, but I actually want to see the code, right? So we have built a real-time code generation that powers the Supernova, and it basically works like this. Everything you see here is described by some sort of model, and we have a semantic engine that takes this language, that takes the model and the target language, like Dart or Swift or Objective-C, and represents that model. And what you see on the right is basically the output that we have. You can see that there is a layout, but it also works in real time, right? So I've created a lot of buttons. You can see that you have stubs prepared for like when you click on sign up on subtext on Facebook. If I change something here, let's say I go on Rampage and I delete it all, then you will see that the code also changes. So I can just make it bare minimum, one screen. You can see that there is a positioned button that is configured with all its properties. If I return it back, then it will be generated again. So now I can switch to another screen. I will disable that so you have more space. Create this and create the email. Maybe I can change things like keyboard. I really want an email keyboard. I will again change the password. For the sake of saving time, I will just do this button. You see the button, right? You just choose the components, and the primary directive of Supernova is to retain the visual information. It it always needs to stay the same, and we are really trying to do that. But you are the one who says we are enhancing it with certain functionality. For the last screen, that one is a bit more complicated. Of course, it's not all about buttons and text fields, but you also usually want to present the data. You want to, yes, we have taken the pictures from the list of attendees. So if you are actually there in the presentation, we are sorry. Anyway, the first thing you will probably want to do here is to make this list an actual list of people, right? So I want to scroll it if there is more than, let's say, 10 attendees. I want to scroll it to the left. So you are probably familiar with concepts of prototypes or cells. Basically, in Supernova, you can say, okay, certain type of content or a certain group of content should be a prototype, and then I can fill it with real data. And you will fill that real data from APIs or from local database, whatever you want. Supernova prepares you the interface structure. So in this case, I really want just one prototype, right? Because that prototype then gets duplicated by a number of items that are there. So I'll really just use the first one, remove the rest. And now I can say this group should become a list somehow, just manage it. So I'll convert it to grid list view. You can see that it created a first one prototype. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit because it's small, but it does create it. And now when I switch to preview mode, well, there is some work to be done on that screen, right? It's not omnipotent just yet. So right now, it actually duplicated the content. But you can say, okay, there are some problems, some obvious problems with it. First, it shouldn't really scroll top to bottom, but left to right. And also, maybe the spacing is wrong. So I will change the cell spacing. You usually have all the major properties available in the property panel. So if you are looking for spacing, if you are looking for separators, you will find it there. We've just chosen the ones that are the most commonly used in vast amount of situations. I will also make it into a horizontal layout, not vertical layout. So now when I switch to preview mode, you can see that it will actually scroll. But there isn't enough people, right? So I will say to Supernova, okay, maybe now 10 people is attending. And you can see that it actually creates me 10 prototypes, which is more important functionality than you might think, because designers are actually very aware of those things, right? And if it shows just one cell, they will say it's wrong. So we actually had to add the option to multiply the cells, and if you do multiple cells, Supernova will just shuffle the content so it looks like a real list from the API. Now I probably also want to do this thing, just convert it to a button. Here we can improve the layout, but I will not do that. Instead, I'll group all of that and say, okay, all of this content is now ready. Make it somehow into the list. So when I convert it to a list, you can see that the edges actually expand because, and you can change that, but in most cases, the lists are from edge to edge. Even though visually it's the same, it will now properly expand when you use the layout. What you should also probably do, you will make the container to be snapped to the bottom edge, so it properly scrolls to the bottom. And I will also make it so it snaps to the edge and resizes properly when I resize the screen. And now when I go to preview, you can see that I've actually created a list of people. That is, of course, just a virtual list duplicated, and each one of those actually has a container there. One last thing that I will do, this, if you check the code, you can see that it's not really a navigation bar or the up bar. It's more like a list of components, but we most certainly want it as a navigation bar. So we have options to convert it to either navigation top one or the bottom navigation as well. So I'll say, okay, convert it to navigation bar and use the design from the selection, which basically infers the information about the navigation bar, like title colors, fonts, background colors. If it's gradient, it will be gradient. You can, of course, modify it as you want. And again, if I switch to a preview, you can now see that this became an actual navigation item. However, this is not a navigation item. This is more of a title. And if you run it on the iOS, it will look exactly the same. Now, when you are exporting, you will export to Flutter. You can you have two modes, not only the real-time mode, but the actual export. You can export the entire project, which will basically take all the screens, prepare you the integration for the project. So you will have iOS code bases and Android code bases. It will get you all the assets properly scaled. You can set that if you want to generate the old resources or 2x or 3x by default. In some other exporters, you will also have different options. Like, for example, on iOS, you will have option to export to Swift 4, Swift 5, and so on. In Flutter, it is the last version. You can also change things like the display project name and so on. Not very interesting, but it just gives you a lot of options. What I also wanted to say is that I was talking about the customization, right? And we actually provide quite a lot of customization, not only for like the code generation, because every developer really prefers something else, be different spacing, or that you just don't want to use comments and so on. We also have different ways how you can export the project itself, so like different folder structures and so on. It's always up to you. So there is a lot of customizations, and if you will play around with Supernova and you are missing something, it would be awesome if you actually gave us feedback about that, because as I said, the Flutter is our youngest platform, and so it is the one that we are iterating the most on. If you also don't know something, we actually have a documentation inside the studio now, so you can just search for Flutter, and it will give you everything about the Flutter we have, the documentation. It costed me half of my soul, so it is pretty extensive. Now we can export the application, so let's do that. Let's export the entire project. Call it Flutter London. And you can see the export is actually pretty fast. So you will get the pub/specs file, which will then allow you to download all the dependencies. If you have enabled the localizations, it will be there. You will have all the table view cells, or all the list cells, really. All the internationalizations files, the main file, of course, and then each screen will have a corresponding Dart file, which is the implementation file. If you have some widgets, it will get exported as well. So what we can do to show you that it actually works, I'll open this. I'll get the packages. Supernova really gets you everything except the packages, because the packages we really want to be up to date. So you will just get them automatically if you have a VS Code or something. One thing I wanted to show you though, before we end this presentation, is that right now, as I export it, there is also a hot reload in Supernova, right? So whatever I change here will actually get propagated to Visual Studio. In fact, if I go to libraries and let's say screens and welcome screen, which is the smallest one, and again, I would delete all of that. You can see that there is a small progress bar, but that will, because you are the first people who are actually seeing the hot reload, that will get removed. But now, when you get to that file, you will see that the code is significantly less extensive. Again, if I just get it back, the code gets back as it should. One last thing that I want to show you also is that if you are working with designers, they will make change to your design, right? And you really want to make your interface to be one-to-one with the sketch file, so you can do that. We've actually attended the Y Combinator, and one of the primary targets that we got was to make the iterations as smooth as possible. So let's say I want to change this text, and I will change it to, like, I don't know why I write this, to I love Flutter. I can use the refresh functionality, select the Flutter London sketch file, and as you can see, now the visual representation is actually different. And when I import it, it will actually change the text. However, if you've noticed, those buttons, those are not represented in sketch file. However, they still stay the same in Supernova. So it actually merges all your information that you did with the stuff that is in Sketch. The merge works in a way that it presents the design information from Sketch, that is the primary directive, and then it preserves all the virtual information that you provided in Supernova. And of course, as you can see, the project is valid. You can run it on, let's say, an iOS simulator. We didn't connect the navigation, so you will not get far enough, but you will at least see the first screen. If you want to do navigation, you can also do that in Supernova. It's very easy. You can just say, okay, make a push animation from a login to a different screen. It gets propagated to that code base. And that's pretty much it. You can, I think, at this point, you can do about 85% of the interfaces in Supernova. What we are currently not supporting are custom widgets that are available. But we are working on that, and once we have the custom widgets, we really hope that the interface will be possible to be automated fully, especially with your help. Thank you.